Welcome, everybody. I am so incredibly excited about this interview today as we have a very special guest. This highly decorated patriot you're looking at is a public speaker, author of the best-selling book, Irresistible Revolution, Marxism's Goal of Conquest, and the Unmaking of the American Military. He is the founder of the Save America's Military PAC, and most importantly, lives with his wife and children in Idaho. Welcome, Matt Lohmeier, to the Real Deal of Parenting podcast. Matt, it is so good to have you here.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thanks.
I know how busy you are and how many interviews you're doing, so I'm really glad you could find the time to come on.
Sure.
Now, before we get into several topics that families need to hear about, let's just briefly touch on your incredible story. So your book, Irresistible Revolution, was published in May of 2021, which, by the way, has over 2,300 five-star reviews. And let me tell you, as an author myself, I am highly impressed, Matt. And this is also the time you were a respected active duty commander in the newly formed U.S. Space Force. But you were not only relieved of your command, but furthermore subjected to an inspector general investigation launched from the Pentagon. Matt, you lost your job, you lost your pension. Walk us through this unfathomable time.
Yeah, one of the active duty pilots I just spoke with last week in an interview I had done offline told me you were getting fired before it was cool. And a lot of active duty service members right now, unfortunately, are the word I like to use is being purged. And that sounds somewhat sensational, but their firing right now is directly the result of the current administration's policies that are causing our service members and many, many good commanders right now to feel like if they're to keep their integrity intact, if they're to live according to their conscience, for example, they need to take a stand, which is going to put them at odds with the service, which is a terrible predicament for many good people in uniform. But as far as my story goes, my recent story and recent history was precisely what you mentioned. I was in command of a space-based missile warning unit in Colorado for the newly formed Space Force. Before that, I had flown F-15s for the Air Force, was a T-38 instructor pilot, and had been in various jobs, but was trained at the DoD's strategy school, the School of Advanced Air and Space Studies. And so I had a bit of a breadth of experience before being in command of a missile warning unit. And as a part of my training, I happened to have learned a great deal about Marxist ideology and Marxist history. And so when I came into command right in the aftermath of George Floyd's death and some of the, I'll call it just political activism for simplicity's sake, that you and your viewers had seen through the country that manifested as stomping on police cars and a disrespect for the civil society and the smashing up of windows of small businesses and so forth and setting things on fire. That kind of activism, that spirit was in fact also unfortunately mirrored or manifested across our armed forces. It showed up at our workplace now it doesn't mean buildings were on fire at our military installations, but it meant that you had both senior military leaders who wear 4 stars on their shoulder, for example, becoming somewhat activist in their both worldview and in their behavior, and they'd put that stuff out on official videos while in uniform. And then you also had like supporting the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, or other critical social justice activist movements that were afoot in the country. And you also had young people in uniform who are just parrots, and they're a mirror of the broader American society, also becoming activists on their social media accounts, encouraging certain cities in the country to burn down, things that should actually end up landing you in prison if you're wearing the uniform of your country when you say them. But they belonged to a kind of, what we've come to call a protected class, if you will, whether it's race-based or sexual preference or gender-based. And so when I saw all of that and the language that was being used to pursue those agendas, I recognized it immediately as being a part of a Marxist revolutionary impulse because I'd studied it so much. I'd seen it unfold in China. I'd seen it unfold in the early formation of the Soviet Union and in many more countries that the American people aren't aware of. And so that's what led me down a path to writing the book that you've mentioned, Irresistible Revolution. And it's also what caused me, before ever considering writing that book, to use my chain of command. I mean, if there's any military listeners here, one of the first questions they would ask is, how come you didn't use your chain of command? Why'd you just write a book and, drop a bomb, so to speak, on your senior military leaders? And of course, I wouldn't have ever done that. I, in fact, used my chain of command, and they happened to agree with me that we had a big problem that they were trying to fix. But they nevertheless seemed powerless to fix.
Right.
And so I'd use my chain of command, but to no avail, to try and eradicate the politicization of our armed forces. I had filed an inspector general's complaint myself against some of the activism that was occurring in my own sphere of influence at my base with an activist base commander. And unfortunately, I filed that complaint during the election season of 2020, the presidential election season. And you can imagine that fell on deaf ears. So they sat on it until January 4th, 5th, 6th. January 6th happened. And the next day I received a written response dismissing my complaint because senior military leaders saw the political writing on the wall. And so all of that was what propelled me to write the book. And that's why I ended up fired, was because in the book I address these very things. I address some of the history of Marxist revolutions. And I give a warning about where this leads our country if left unchecked.
Wow. So, fast forward to present day, you're now a highly sought out public speaker. You're a consultant on matters of Marxist ideology and tactics, CRT, the betterment of military culture, and the preservation of our liberties. So let's start there. And you touched on it briefly, Marxism and CRT, because namely critical race theory, it is something that is becoming a particularly hot topic across public schools. And I know so many of our parents, the little we've touched on it here, so many parents are very confused, and it seems there's mixed information going out. So if you can kind of shed some light there.
Well, I think what I'd like to say to parents is you need to first pay very close attention to the material that your schools are exposing the material that is being exposed to your children in the school environment. If you have children in the public education system, for example. I don't have children in the public education system. I homeschool. My wife and I have agreed that that's the best path for us, given the circumstances. But I'll tell you what, my wife would have loved to have a breather. I work all day outside of the home for the most part. She does not anymore. And she would have loved the break during the day to send our kids off to the public education babysitting program. Unfortunately, given what we understand is happening, even in Idaho, where we live, of all things. I mean, we thought moving here we would have got away from some of this, but there is both critical race theory, which I'll touch upon in just a second, is one issue, but it's a small slice of a much larger pie of what is. You scare people off when you say, or you cause it to fall on deaf ears because people don't understand what it means. Marxist ideology. They think, well, yeah, okay, what is that? I forget that because I know it so well. There is an oppressor versus oppressed narrative that is fundamental to the Marxist ideological narrative of world events. And in Marx's time, and Marx and Engels, who wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848, because the best way to foment the violent revolutionary impulse in Western Europe in 1848 was class strife, a capitalist bourgeoisie ruling class on the one hand versus a proletariat working class on the other, and exploiting the division that was the divisive potential that existed between the economic class stratification there was the best way to incite the violent revolutionary impulse. They capitalized on that narrative. But the beauty and sinister nature of Marxist ideology is that it doesn't have to be about economic class stratification. It can be about race, for example, if that is the topic that is most likely to incite the violent revolutionary impulse in your own country and in the West. And given the great advances that we've made in the past century plus, and especially in the United States, race is an excellent topic to propagandize in order to continue to sow the seeds of division among American society. And so that, at the moment, is the most prevalent topic that is exploited by the Marxist revolutionary in order to cause people to have an emotional, visceral response towards one another. We get into a finger-pointing, blaming game, saying that certain people, based on their race, are either victims and oppressed, or they are aggressors, they are oppressors, and are a part of the problem of society that needs to be fixed. It's a white-black narrative. Our service members of the past couple of years saw this a great deal, heard it a great deal, and I had young people coming into my office experiencing now in the military environment the same thing that is happening in the public education system, even K through 12, not just higher these institutions of higher learning like the university settings, for example. They'd show up and say, clearly the military is only concerned about a black-white divide, and whether it's perceived or real, they're making it a far more heavy-handed part of their weekly talking points in the military than is natural. And our service members don't really care about race. They don't care about your politics. They've been trained to be apolitical. But we have people injecting this into the military right now. So in the public education system, what I'd say to the parents is, with regards to critical race theory, it's been around for decades. You've just not known it's been creeping into the public education system. And so you need to do a little bit of homework, because you're not going to get it out of this interview. Learning what some of the key tenets of critical race theory are. It's rooted in a much deeper school of thought called critical theory, which is critical of all things Western civilization, Judeo-Christian values, probably the values of the people listening to this show. Everything about the critical race theory narrative, while it's couched in kindly vocabulary, kindly language, and usually the presenters have a smile on their face when they're talking to you about it, it denigrates certain race demographics, predominantly whites, although blacks can be denigrated as well if they happen to be aligned with a more American Judeo-Christian worldview. Who's the guy that just ran for governor in California recently? It was Larry Elder, black right. Gentleman. Mm-hmm. He was called the face of white supremacy by those who are proponents of the critical race theory school of thought, because he's conservative, because he believes in America's founding values, and because he says critical race theory is garbage and that it pits Americans against one another. And for that, this black American patriot has been labeled the face of white supremacy, which just goes to show you how ideology works. But you need to be aware that your children, I hear this from parents all over the country, in fact, right now, are being taught very subtly, in many cases, to distrust their classmates based on race demographics, based on any number now of, outside of critical race theory, values that the new woke ideology is imposing on our young students. They're taught to rate themselves and score themselves on what their true value in society is based on their what they call intersectionalities. How many oppressed identifiers or class identifiers can you be a part of? Well, let's see. I'm black, so I've got some good value there because I'm in a minority group and I've been oppressed. I'm gay, and so I've got a higher value there and I've been oppressed. I kind of think I want to become a man or a woman, and so they're actually teaching this stuff, and they're asking our children, hey, do you meet any of these criteria? Because you can gain a higher value in society and against your classmates who are the oppressors if in fact you identify in one of these protected or uh, yeah, I suppose that's the best way to put it, protected identity groups.
Sure.
And so I've mentioned several of them, but there's probably a dozen or more of these. And they're really ugly things. And our children are being indoctrinated, exposed to this stuff subtly by, even if they've got 4 good teachers, they're going to have one teacher who's really interested in pushing this on your children. So it's, you need to really pay attention, ask your children questions, and find out what it is they're hearing from their teachers, and meet your teachers. If your children are in the public education system, meet them, and you've got a good sense about you have the obligation to judge. And it's not just you, it's like, do not judge, that you be not judged. Well, that's true too, but you have an obligation as a parent to judge the surroundings and context that your children are in, and make critical decisions about how to protect them from salacious influences while they're in their formative years.
Yes, and as a former teacher, I was a teacher for 10 years, and I don't want to collectively group them all, because there still is phenomenal teachers with good morals, good compasses, who are there to educate the children as they should be. But what we are seeing, it's like this snowball that just keeps growing. And to piggyback off what you're saying, is what's putting pressure upon children and what's putting pressure upon parents is we're being forced to look at these things as, well, you're not a Christian if you don't love and accept this, if you don't embrace this, and so, here at The Real Deal of Parenting, Abby Johnson and I get those attacks all the time. Well, you call yourselves a good Christian mother,
Right.
but you're not supporting this. You need to support this and love this person and accept this. You need to be doing that for your children. And that is just not the case. And I feel so bad for the group of parents that are stuck. Like, we're really seeing the middle starting to shrink out, right? There's not much of a gray area left. You are choosing one side or the other. And this is the side. So many parents, Matt, come to us and say, well, I would die for my child. I would lay on a sword for them. But will you go to great lengths? Will you go speak up at the school board meeting?
Right.
No. Will you stand up to the teacher who's indoctrinating your child? No. And I know parents love their children, but this veil of confusion is so dangerous right now, because what is happening so subtly, and in some places, what we're sharing, it's not so subtle. Like, when we're getting this information that we're putting out to reveal to parents, we're double checking, triple checking things, because we're like, this can't be the case.
Right.
This can't be real life. This couldn't have happened in a classroom with these precious, innocent children. But sure enough, it is. It's happening in all 50 states, not just these liberal ones. Like you said, you think Idaho would be this nice, safe place. It's not just happening in California and New York. It's happening in all 50 states. And so it is our duty as parents to go the extra mile right now into checking all the surroundings of our children, their classmates, their teacher, their coaches, their after school programs, because now we're also seeing teachers and coaches, telling children, well, we're your safe spot. You can tell us if you're thinking and feeling this way. You don't need to tell your parents.
That's right.
And they are crossing so many boundaries, and that once you're over that line, there's no returning from. And so I too, Matt, like you and your wife, I homeschool 4 or 5 of my children right now. And every day I feel like I'm being prepared for sainthood. And I have my moments where I'm like,
oh yeah,
as I'm sure your wife, is like, honey, is this the right decision? But it is. We're seeing so many families who, it takes 2 incomes to support their family, but they're making just the ultimate sacrifices to go down to 1 income, to have a parent stay at home, to homeschool. Because the more that's being revealed, what we're seeing, it's like it is not worth risking and leaving them in.
Yeah, well, homeschooling, I wish I could say everyone could do it, and perhaps that's not true. I haven't thought through that, but not everyone's necessarily even in a position to do
Sure.
that. There are some single parent homes, for example, that are obligated to also put food on the table, and so maybe the burden of homeschooling, even married couples who are still together, they don't necessarily have the opportunity to homeschool. I want to address something you said, though, because you make an important point. And the ideologue, the activist, the trained organizer are very interested in exploiting the Christian's moral compass for their own purposes and weaponizing what you say are your morals. And so they'll, of course, tell you that your current stance on particular issues is unchristian. They don't care about your Christianity, first off. So let's remember that your Christianity is your own, and it's about you and your relationship with God, and it's not about what the activist has to tell you about your Christianity. But there's a really specific incompatibility with the Christian worldview and Marxist ideology that I'd like to point out. The Marxist worldview says that there is something wrong with the other. It's not about looking internal like the Christian religion might have some. It's about the other person. It's about the others in society. They are the problem, and if you can set about fixing everything about you, then perhaps you can create a better world in which the better angels of our nature, so to speak, will be manifest on the world stage and society can flourish. It's Christianity is exactly the opposite. You look internal, you fix yourself, and you don't judge the other. You make your own bed, as Jordan Peterson says, before you try and go out and fix the world. You fix what is internally incompatible in your own soul, and then you go out and you serve others to make the world a better place for some hope of a better reward in the afterlife. But Marxism doesn't believe in any of that, and it'll throw you under the bus as quickly as it can, and so don't be afraid of being bullied by the ideologue who doesn't share your worldview or pretends to understand your worldview. And here's something else Christ was very firm on: don't offend the little children. It's better that a millstone were hanged about their necks if they were to offend the little children, because
Yes.
that was an off limits. Now, he was very firm on this. As kind and merciful as we'd like to think our Lord was, there's certain things he didn't mess around with, and that's one of them. We have no business messing around with the indoctrination of children or pretending like they have somehow the ability to make certain choices for themselves, either about their sexuality or their so-called gender identity. You have an obligation as a parent to protect them from insidious influences at a critical time in world history in which evil is run amok. Don't be soft on these things. You can't afford, for your children's sake or your sake, to be soft on these things. And then the last point I wanted to make, because you touched on all of these things, and so I'm kind of echoing what you've said, but you mentioned the word subtle. These are subtle influences in many cases, and that's true. And in political, ideological jargon, and in communist jargon, it's called subversion. The tactics of subversion, because people don't know it when they're being indoctrinated oftentimes.
Right.
What's fascinating is that there's such an aggressive play afoot right now to indoctrinate and to win the day, so to speak, that they've almost moved past subversion in many cases to an overt affront against our values, and they know that they can be quite open about it. Whether you're talking on the global stage in a Great Reset or those kinds of things, that they're openly stating their aims. Whereas before they've almost lurked in the shadows to accomplish an agenda. There's still plenty of that, and so don't be fooled. But there's also a lot of in-your-face, direct, overt attempts at winning the hearts and minds of every human alive and steering them away from the values that they've believed in their whole lives. And we need to be stronger now than ever.
Yes. And I agree, in some places it is subtle, but overall, there's so many of us, and I'm just going to, for lack of better terminology, people that are on our team, Matt, who
Yeah.
see this from this side. It's so right in our faces. We're oftentimes, getting impatient with the other side only because we care. That it's like, how do you not see this? How do you not see this? It's right in your face. And before we shift gears, I do just want to say too, I talk about this so often. I've mentioned it several times recently about even biblically, you know, messing with children. You know, when people do bad things to adults, incredibly wrong. That's
Hmm.
terrible. Should never happen. But when people do bad things to children, that's a different level.
Hmm.
That's a different level of evil. And these children, your children, Matt, my children, they're God's children. God entrusted us to care for his children. And when these evil humans are trying to indoctrinate them, whatever reason they have, a lot of people are pushing it. Oh, this is just love, and we're just teaching them this acceptance and this. You know, we're seeing toddlers and primary students drug to drag queen
That's
events
right.
because it's love and it's June and it's pride and this is beautiful. No, no.
That's
And if
right.
you and people have to put their foot down, and we've gotten to the point here, we're one of the very few parenting platforms who have done so, and enough is enough. These are
Hmm.
innocent children. You see the looks on their faces in still shots and in video footage where they're confused. You see these little innocent people where they're like, they're even, is this normal? Is this correct? You see the confusion. And I am just begging everybody to take a good hard look in the mirror and ask yourself if you are standing on the correct side of history, if not for your sake, for your child's sake. Because it is, I don't know about you, Matt, but I don't know where we're at in this process of tribulation, but I'll tell you,
Hmm.
I think it's going to get worse before it gets better.
You're absolutely right about that. And I appreciate you, emphasizing this point that we take a stand.
Yes.
Uh, we need to take a stand, and it doesn't mean not everyone has an activist spirit. It's usually decent, fairly conservative people don't like getting in other people's faces. They're the kind of live and let live personalities,
Yes.
and despite being labeled bigots and other things. So it's difficult for some of the people that may be inclined to listen to what you have to say to think about being activists. So if that's not your cup of tea, then don't worry about it. Don't do that. But you do need to take a stand, and you need to protect those that you've been given a stewardship for, especially our children.
Yes. Yes. Okay, so I want to shift gears a little bit and let's go to the war in Ukraine.
Mm,
What do you think is really going on there, and what do you predict for the foreseeable future?
okay. As a caveat up front, um, these are my views, of course. You shouldn't need to preface anything you say with that. Of course, that should be a given. I know trained military personnel who probably would disagree with my views, and that's just fine. I know plenty of respectable military personnel, strategists, and retired general officers who've been in this arena who happen to agree with what I'm going to say about some of this. But the caveat is that we could take an entire episode just to discuss this
I'm sure.
and to lay out some of the facts. So we won't have time to do that today. But here's a general principle that your listener needs to be aware of. Okay. They've learned this in the past couple of years already, just with the COVID narrative, if they hadn't already recognized it before that, is that the information that you are fed, either in mainstream media, social media, whatever your source of information is already somewhat polluted on a day-to-day basis in relative peacetime. Okay, even in peacetime, there is a kind of information war that's ever about. Not all of the characters or personalities you think you're seeing on social media are even real, and they can be quite popular. And information that comes from those not real bots, for example, that China or Russia put out, or the United States is putting out, they can go viral. They can spread like wildfire. And so there's an information war that's always afoot, even in relative peacetime, that attempts to persuade uh, the masses of certain outlook on things. Okay, uh, and that's just true, and people shouldn't disagree about that, and I know what I'm talking about in that regard. Now, a staple of warfare is deception. Okay? People need to understand that also. And people who know what they're talking about also won't disagree with what I'm saying here. What I might say about later about what I think is going on in Ukraine, people may disagree with, and that's fine. Even well-intentioned, somewhat decent states, and I use states in the international relations sense, like countries, who are engaged in warfare will employ deception as a means of accomplishing their aims, their political aims. Okay? Whether you agree with that morally or not, it's just the reality. Warfare is an arena of great deception. It's a part of your strategy. When a conflict kicks off in a country like Ukraine between a great power, Russia, and Ukraine, a bordering state, you can expect that both from Russia and Ukraine and from the West, our allies, and our own country, you're going to have information coming your way that isn't exactly the truth. But in the information that's coming your way, you're able to sort out a bunch of data, pick out what's really going on, where troops are at, what the relative number of those troops, all of that you're able to glean. But what are the underlying motives? Who's funding the wars? What are the aims of Russia or Ukraine? Those what is the aim of the Biden administration, our current DoD senior military appointees? Those are things that are very difficult to start to get at just from reading the news. Okay. So that said, I say that up front as a kind of forewarning about where my head's at. You don't, even if you've been paying attention, and I wouldn't expect most Americans are still paying attention to the
Right.
minutia that's going on. There's still a war going on over there. Let me just say a few things so that we're not on this for too long. But every state actor, every head of state, Putin included, it is their purview to decide what it is that they consider to be threats to their political sovereignty and their territorial integrity. This is not an apology for Putin, by the way. I'm not saying he's a good guy in saying this, but this is just how the world works. Every head of state, whether it's Joe Biden or Zelensky or Putin or Xi Jinping, it is their prerogative to decide what it is that is most of interest in the survival of their own state, what is in the interest of their own citizens, or in the case of many countries, unfortunately, those heads of state aren't interested in the well-being of their citizens or the population in their country. I think our current administration also happens to fall in that category, by the way. And they get to decide when to go to war to accomplish certain political aims. That's just, now, sometimes countries are forced into war. Ukraine has been on the defensive because it's been forced into a war because of an invasion from a bordering state. So in its defense, Ukraine is justified in waging war. And we're getting into just war. All right. But, and you might rightly assume that Putin is an aggressor and the Russian forces who have crossed a border are unjustly waging a conflict against innocent Ukraine. But I will say this, that is a gross oversimplification of how the international arena works. And what people need to understand is the United States doesn't get to decide, and our Western allies don't get to decide what Putin deems a critical threat to his national security and what drives war. And so, all of that said, there's been a lot of propaganda from the West right now that says, and I'm deliberately calling it propaganda, and we are fueling the perpetuation of this conflict as we continue to dump hundreds of billions of dollars into Ukraine with loads of weapons and prop up our weapons industry. And we're sharing we're sharing this narrative that, well, Ukraine has this good fighting chance of staving off the Russians, and the Russians suck. And if they keep this up for long enough, they're really decimating Putin's force, and so on and so forth. That's just not true. Ukraine military doesn't have a chance against Putin's Russian forces. Putin and the Russian forces will stay in Ukraine until they decide that their political objectives have been met and that they've accomplished their aims. And they will either retain some portion of Ukraine or they'll completely withdraw their forces and go back to Russia. I don't know when that will take place. It could be next month, and it could be 12 months from now. But I don't believe that what Putin has been saying since the beginning and has warned about for many years, that he intended to demilitarize Ukraine. I don't think he was misstating his intentions. That's my personal view. I think he intended to completely come in and weaken the military state of affairs in Ukraine, purge some of the Western influence in Ukraine. The United States is involved in a lot of corruption in Ukraine. The Ukrainian people don't trust their own government. Here's another example of propaganda. We build Zelensky up as a hero in the news. Fine, and I can see why you can do that. Ukrainian people don't trust Zelensky any further than they can throw him. To the Ukrainian people, many of them would prefer Putin as their leader to Zelensky. There are over 150 political parties in the Ukrainian political apparatus that ran candidates for political office in the parliament in 2015. I think there were 152 political offices. We think Democrat, Republican in this country. Think 152 political offices. The Ukrainian people don't even know all the political offices. Political parties. The Ukrainian people don't trust their government. They don't like their government in many cases. If they speak Russian natively, they hate their government because they've been bombed by their government for a number of years ever since, well, there's a long history here, but in 2014, when Russia and Ukraine were last in a conflict, the Ukrainian government has treated very poorly its Russian population. They've made it illegal to speak Russian in their country. And so if your listener doesn't like what I'm saying, I completely understand it, or if you don't. But here's what here's the picture I'm trying to paint by pointing out some of this. You're being propagandized constantly, whether in relative peacetime, but we're in a war situation right now. And in as much as maybe you've not come to trust the Biden administration for various reasons, don't think that they're only solely telling you the truth right now about everything that's happening in Ukraine, by the way, or the mainstream media. The fact is, the world affairs are far more complex than you can ever learn about in the media narrative. There is an ugly war going on, and the victims of any war are the innocent civilians who get caught up in the government disputes. There is a corrupt Ukrainian government fighting a somewhat, I don't want to call them tyrannical, although I can understand people's characterization of that, dictatorial Russian regime. And those are corrupt governments fighting for what they perceive are their own best interests, and civilians suffer. There's children and women and families that are suffering right now. But it's foolish to think that the United States should get involved when we face so many of our issues here at home, in my view. We've got plenty of wars, so to speak, ongoing right now in our country that we should be desperately engaged in, and we're continuing to crush our economy in support of a conflict that frankly isn't in our vital national security interests. Honestly, I know there's a lot to tease out there. I've said perhaps enough to really maybe ruffle some people's feathers, and that's fine. But I'll leave it at that and say war is a complex issue that few people in this country understand as a phenomenon in and of itself. Then the strategy and the motivators involved and the information you receive is far more complex still. So you don't need to feel compulsed, by the way, to support one side or the other. Yeah, you can have sympathy for the innocent victims who are civilians in these things, but you don't need to pick a government. You don't need to pick a flag. You know, don't feel morally compulsed. One minute they're telling you this, that, and the other about COVID and about Black Lives Matter, and the next minute they're telling you need to throw up a Ukraine flag. There's probably a reason for that. I won't get into it today.
That'll be on episodes 2 and 3.
There's a lot going on there that I can't uncover today or unpack. But There is an agenda afoot, make no mistake about it. There are those who are interested in having your mind and heart be wrapped up in everything it wants you to be interested in. And there are certain battles in your own sphere of influence you need to be focused on, and particularly your children, our own domestic policy problems like our border problems. Those are our own domestic problems, our own energy independence or dependence at the moment, and a collapsing economy, coming food shortages, which I know quite a bit about. Those are things you need to be thinking about, and not be distracted from preparing for your family's well-being during a really difficult year and two ahead. And instead, they'd rather have you be distracted with some of that stuff.
Yes. And I think something I just want to reemphasize is people, the small group of people who still think everything's just organic coming out and what we're being told is just all reactionary to just what's happening. No, everything, there's a set agenda.
There is an
And
agenda.
there is.
Now,
And
well, even though there's an agenda, the planners of that agenda can't always predict outcomes, and
sure,
we
yeah,
live in a complex world system. And so their inputs that they think will generate certain outcomes might very well backfire. And while they're trying to destroy certain countries and prop up others, um, and I'm talking global planners, because
right.
that's exactly at the top level what's happening. Um, God just might surprise every one of them with his own plans sometimes. But it's amazing how far he lets some of this go, and wicked men pursue their wicked agenda before even toppling their efforts. So we're living in a great and dreadful age. I mean, we're going to see some really interesting things in the years ahead.
I agree. I agree. And the public is starting to hear about what's happening in the military. And I know you mentioned this in the beginning. You just recently interviewed an F-16 pilot who is being
Yeah.
forced out of the service because he refuses the jab, which is just one of over 700 pilots being purged at the moment for the same issue. And quite frankly, I know there are so many concerned parents who often reach out to you, Matt, um, just about their kids even getting into the military to serve. So can you talk to us about that?
Yeah. So I set up a new show a couple of weeks back, the Matt Lohmeier show. You can watch it on YouTube, but it's also on every podcasting platform. It's just better. Sometimes people share slides on the interviews, and
Yeah.
so it's better to watch. But yeah, you can see that F-16 pilot's interview there is why I pointed out. And it's good information for the American people to be aware of. In 2019, I want to say it was, then Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Dave Goldfein, warned publicly that we were in a pilot shortage crisis, is the word he used. We were 1,650 pilots short in the Air Force alone, below what we need for combat ready levels. That was 2019. Things haven't got better since then. The taxpayers listening to this, part of their taxpayer money goes to incentivize pilots every single year to stay in the military and keep flying combat platforms, because they're wanting to get out of the military already. Now, again, this is before any COVID policy stuff, but we've been having a problem retaining our pilots because of our high ops tempo and other reasons for a very long time. Pile on to that crisis now a new policy that says unless you're fully vaccinated, you're going to be separated from the service. Well, right now, as I understand it, there's over 700 pilots who still, across all branches of the military, who are aviators. Now, there's tens of thousands of other service members, but I'm just talking pilots because we had a crisis already. Over 700 pilots are still refusing the vaccine. Most of them, nearly all of them, have done so on religious grounds, saying that it's against their ethical or religious worldview, that they don't agree with the forced or the compulsory medical policy. And so they've submitted religious accommodation requests for that policy, which have all been denied. And so now the average time in service of these combat aviators is 14 years. Many of them have over 20 years of service. 70% of them have at one point been qualified instructor pilots. Nearly 20% of them are inextricably tied to our nuclear enterprise. And we're going to purge them from the military. You can't replace that overnight. You can't even replace it in a year or two. This is many years of experience, many combat deployments. And so many of them have been grounded, no longer currently able to fly because of their decision. And they're awaiting adjudication of their cases and whether or not they're going to have to be forced into separation. That said, it's important to point out that that would put our air forces, and I use that term to mean across all branches of the military, our air forces in a position that wouldn't be able to compete against great competitors on the world stage, China and Russia, for example. We've got powerful and talented pilots, the best in the world as far as I'm concerned. But that will change very quickly if the current administration decides to get rid of the 2 to 3% of service members. You've got aircraft maintainers who are in that mix, who make sure we have a ready fleet. So yeah, that's a big ongoing problem. That's one of the things you brought up. You mentioned my show, but you also mentioned something else, and I've forgotten what it was. But that's a little bit of some of the backstory of what's going on with this pilot purge. Maybe there's one other question I didn't answer though, Reagan, that you'd specifically mentioned.
No, as before we were, going to start to wrap, I wanted to ask if you could, you were just filled with so much knowledge. And again, I feel like you and I could have an entire series, a 12 episode series to go through all of these things. But knowing what you know and speaking solely as a parent right now, what is one piece of advice that you would offer our 600,000 parents?
Okay, let me think about it carefully before I answer that one. I've already said you need to pay very close attention to the environment your children are in. And so I can't use that one anymore.
Right.
Here, let me say this, okay? One piece of advice to parents specifically. We've covered, first off, go back and listen to everything Reagan and I have talked about and pay very close attention, because I think there's some really solid advice in there for parents. Here's one piece of advice that I've got for you. The arena that you and your children find yourselves in right now, I'm surprised all the time. I speak all around the country. I meet conservative, Christian parents around the country all the time. And even though they're attending events where they talk about these things, the arena in which they find themselves is evolving so quickly. There are so many agendas afoot. There's so much of the usurpation of language and the changing of definitions and terms, like the confusion of tongues, you could call it. You need to do some extra diligence right now to pay close attention. If you are somewhat plugged into society, and if your children are in society, you need to do a little extra homework than maybe you even want to do to learn about what's happening. Otherwise, you're going to be caught up in the wake of negative influences, the subversive agenda that for the last century has spurred revolutions throughout every region on the earth, whether you knew it or not. When you talk Cold War, we talk Cold War history,
right,
we tend to think of Korean War, Vietnam War, and then the collapse of the Soviet Union, 1990. But what we don't, those are the big wars that the United States and our allies were directly involved in and committing a lot of troops to. That isn't even scratching the surface of communist revolutions that took place and all throughout South America. We happen to know about Cuba and the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, I think it was. There were revolutions sweeping across South America. There were revolutions sweeping across Europe and Southeast Asia. And we don't think about them because we weren't committing troops directly in those conflicts, but there were humans who were participants in these civil conflicts that were the direct outcome of the very kind of evil spiritual impulse that you and I are experiencing in this country right now. And parents need to be aware of that, because those who are subject to that civil strife, the starvation based on government policies, the bullying that took place from Marxist ideologues in those countries, they knew something was off, just like you do. They knew that things were getting bad, just like you do, but they didn't perceive just how much preparation needed to go into that, in preparing for the awful, inevitable outcome. There's a guy named Stathis Kalivas who wrote a book called The Logic of Violence and Civil War, and he interviewed a lot of the survivors of these civil wars throughout the Cold War. And one of the things they always said was, we knew it was getting bad, but we didn't know it was getting that bad until our country was swept up in violence, or until everyone started starving. And that's, I know this sounds fatalistic, but my advice to parents is start paying a little closer attention than even you have been up until this point. Start to learn about how it is that you can prepare your family to weather difficult times ahead. And your obligation is to your family. It's not to corrupt government, never has been. Not in this. We don't believe in that. Our government's purpose is to protect and secure your rights. Period. It long ago far exceeded the bounds of its proper role. Your job isn't to prop up any of that. Your job is to protect your family, and in fact, in some cases, protect against that. And so, prepare against the tough time. And if I could add in a spiritual note, I do this at the end of my book. In as non-preachy a way as I know how, I said, look, we need a kind of national repentance. Yes. And what that means to everyone might look a little bit different based on the tradition they hail from. If you're a Christian, it means, you know what that means to some degree, and it's turning to Christ and analyzing your walk with him. If you're a Jew, then turn to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and learn to treat fellow humans with the kind of dignity and respect while standing your ground that is incumbent upon you because of your religious tradition. If you're an atheist, well, then at least turn to and respect and love our founding principles, the Judeo-Christian principles that secured our liberties. All of us need to turn about and reinvestigate what it was that liberated this country from the oppressive spirit that has characterized so much of human history. And we need to grab a hold of that so that we can somewhat unify. And if that's never going to happen across the entire country, but it can happen in your community. And so be a part of that revitalizing spirit that helps unify those around you. And that can only happen at the grassroots level. And maybe then we can have some hope of that spreading into a federal government. They're only a reflection of us at the local level after all anyway.
Yes. Wow. That was powerful. So as we're wrapping here, Matt, let's talk about the best places for people to find you. As we've been having this live interview, people are chiming in, wow, I really like this guy. Oh my gosh, I needed to hear this. And so I know your current efforts are in making a difference in the political arena. SAMPAC.org, which is Save America's Military. You've founded a political action committee that you hope will help land some strong conservatives, preferably veterans, but not necessarily, in the Senate and House Armed Services Committees who can help depoliticize our military. And as you mentioned, I know you have your new show out too, the Matt Lohmeier Show. So with all that to say, Where is the best place for people to keep tabs on you?
Well, I suppose I'm on social media, much to my chagrin, Facebook, Twitter, so people can find me there. I try and post links to shows that I do there and things. But you did mention, I mean, there's two main places people can go. You can see my political efforts at sampac.org, SAMPAC. And you can also go to MatthewLohmeier.com. My last name is spelled, well, it's on the screen there, so take a look. But LOHMEIER, MatthewLohmeier.com is my personal website that I've had for some time. And I link to those other efforts that I'm doing. So that's probably the best place. And it's a place where people can reach out to me as well. There's a contact feature on that website. People send me emails. Whether or not I get to respond to all of them is a different question, but I do read every email I get. And there's a link there to my show on YouTube as well that people are that they can click on and access the interview that I just referenced. And by the way, I'm not a political animal, even though I'm talking about politics a lot. My time and energy is spent reading, thinking about, and talking about a great deal of things outside of politics and the military. And that show, the Matt Lohmeier Show, is going to be a reflection of that in the year to come. And I think if people like what they heard here, they're going to find some interest in what I have to say and the guests that I interview on that show in the months ahead.
Awesome. I agree. And you know what I'm going to do for everybody is I'm just going to take all of those links that what you talked about, and I'm going to put them in the comments below. So it's easy
Great.
for everybody to find and pull up. So with that said, Matt Lohmeier, I cannot thank you enough for being here with us today on The Real Deal of Parenting. I want to thank you for your service, for your bravery in speaking out, and finally for your deep conviction in ministry with all you're presently doing. Truly, I thank you.
Well, thanks for hosting me.
Yes. And honestly, I didn't know that this would happen, but I really think you're going to have to come back. Like, I think we're going to need like part 2, part 3.
Let's do it.
Wonderful. Okay. Thank you again, Matt.
Yeah. Thanks, Reagan.